Have you ever wondered what the Bible really says about divorce and remarriage? Are people who have divorced living in sin in the eyes of God? This is a topic that touches the deepest parts of our lives and emotions, and it has caused a lot of confusion and controversy both inside and outside the church. Today, I want to invite you to join me on a journey through the scriptures to understand what God has to say about divorce. Is it a sin in all situations? What happens to those who wish to remarry after a divorce? In this video, we will explore the biblical teachings and the contexts in which they were given so you can get the full picture. My goal is to help you understand not just the rules, but also God's heart on this delicate matter. If you stay until the end, I assure you that you will have a clearer vision and a better understanding of what the Bible really teaches about divorce and remarriage. How did God originally design marriage? To better understand what God thinks about divorce, we must first go back to the beginning, to the moment when God created marriage. In the book of Genesis, specifically in chapter 2, verse 24, we read, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." This verse not only speaks of a physical union, but also of a deep emotional and spiritual connection between two people. In those times, society was very different from ours. Families were the central nucleus, and marriage was seen as a social, economic, and religious contract. But beyond these functions, marriage had a divine purpose. God designed it to be a permanent and exclusive relationship. The phrase "one flesh" speaks of an inseparable connection and unity that is not easily broken. Imagine the Garden of Eden, a place of perfect harmony and peace where Adam and Eve lived in a sinless relationship, in complete communion with God and with each other. This is God's ideal for marriage, a relationship of love, trust, and unity. But what makes this design so special, and why is it so important to God? First, marriage is a picture of the unbreakable covenant between Christ and the church. In Ephesians 5, verses 25 to 27, Paul compares the relationship between a husband and wife to the relationship between Christ and the church. Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy and present her without blemish. In the same way, marriage should be a relationship of sacrificial love and unshakable commitment. Second, marriage reflects the nature of the Creator. Our God is a God of faithfulness and commitment. In the Old Testament, the relationship between God and Israel is often described as a marriage. Israel's unfaithfulness is compared to adultery, while God's faithfulness is like that of a loyal husband who forgives and restores. Third, marriage provides a safe and stable context for the procreation and upbringing of children. Children are a blessing from God, and within the framework of marriage, they can be raised in an environment of love and stability. It is interesting to note that in many ancient cultures, marriage was primarily seen as a political or economic alliance. However, from the biblical perspective, it is much more than that. It is a spiritual relationship with an eternal purpose. This elevated view of marriage highlights the seriousness with which we should approach this union. As we reflect on the original design of marriage, it is important to ask ourselves, how am I living out this truth in my life? Do I value and protect my relationship as God designed it? In a world where divorce is common, remembering God's original plan for marriage can inspire us to strive for unity, faithfulness, and love in our relationships. Let us always remember that, although we face challenges, God's design for marriage is a model of unshakable love and eternal faithfulness. Why did Moses allow divorce in the Old Testament? This is an interesting question, and to understand it, we need to dive into the social, political, and religious context of that time. In ancient times, the Israelite society strictly followed Mosaic law, which regulated all aspects of life, including marriage and divorce. In Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4, Moses permitted divorce, but not because God fully agreed with it, but because of the hardness of the human heart. Society at that time was patriarchal and often unjust toward women. A man could divorce his wife for trivial reasons, leaving her in a very vulnerable position with no support. Moses, guided by God, established certain regulations to reduce the negative consequences of this practice. According to the law, if a man wanted to divorce his wife, he had to give her a certificate of divorce. This document had an important purpose: to protect the woman by allowing her to remarry and preventing her from being stigmatized or left in destitution. Although this measure was not perfect, it represented a significant advance in an era where women had few legal protections. Interestingly, this concession from Moses also reveals a deeper truth about human nature. The hardness of heart mentioned in Matthew 19, verse 8, where Jesus refers to this permissiveness, shows us that human hearts were, and still are, inclined towards sin and stubbornness. Moses understood the reality of human imperfection and sought a solution that could minimize harm and protect the most vulnerable. It is important to understand that this regulation did not represent God's ideal for marriage. Rather, it was a temporary response to the human inability to fully live out the divine purpose. In Malachi 2 verse 16, God clearly expresses, "For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel." This reinforces the idea that God's original plan for marriage is a permanent and sacred union. Sometimes, concessions and temporary solutions are necessary due to the hardness of our hearts or the difficult circumstances we face. However, we must always remember that God's ideal is restoration, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Are there areas in your life where you have made concessions due to the hardness of your heart? Perhaps in your relationships, you have opted for temporary solutions instead of seeking the complete restoration that God desires for you. I invite you to reflect on this and to ask God to soften your heart, guide you, and help you work toward reconciliation and restoration in your relationships. Let us remember that although Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of our hearts, God's ultimate purpose is always unity, love, and lasting commitment. Let us strive to live according to this divine ideal, allowing our lives to reflect God's faithfulness and grace. What did Jesus teach about divorce? His words are key to understanding God's heart on this issue. Let's look at what Jesus said and how we can apply his teachings in our lives today. In Jesus' time, marriage was a fundamental institution in Jewish society, but there were also many interpretations and legal debates surrounding it. The Pharisees, who were experts in the law, approached Jesus with a tricky question: is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? This question reflected a controversy of the time regarding the causes allowed for divorce, a discussion that divided the rabbinical schools. Jesus, in his response, took them back to the beginning, to God's original design for marriage. In Matthew 19, verses 4 to 6, he said, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate.'" With these words, Jesus reaffirmed the sanctity and indissolubility of marriage. But the Pharisees, seeking to justify themselves, asked why Moses allowed divorce. Jesus explained, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning." Here, Jesus emphasized that Moses' concession did not represent God's ideal, but was a response to the reality of human sin. Jesus made a clear exception for divorce in cases of sexual immorality. "I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery." This exception is due to the seriousness of infidelity, which deeply breaks the marital covenant. However, even in these cases, Jesus' intention is not to promote divorce but to highlight the seriousness of marital commitment. Jesus' words about divorce were radical and countercultural in his time. They challenged permissive practices and called for a deeper, more respectful understanding of marriage. Jesus was not merely referring to a legalistic interpretation of the law, but to a transformed heart that seeks to honor God in all areas of life. As we reflect on Jesus' teachings, it is vital to ask ourselves, how can we apply these principles in our own lives? First, we must value marriage as a sacred, committed, and permanent union. Second, we must seek restoration and forgiveness in our relationships rather than opting for quick and easy solutions. Third, we must remember that God's grace is available to us, even in our failures and weaknesses. Jesus calls us to a higher standard, one that reflects God's love and faithfulness. If we face difficulties in our relationships, let us seek His guidance and strength. Let us remember that although the hardness of our hearts may lead us to failure, God's transforming power can restore and renew our lives and marriages. The teachings of Paul in his letters are also key to understanding the Christian view of marriage and divorce. Today, I want to explore his instructions with you and see how we can apply them in our daily lives. In the first century, the early church lived in a diverse and complex society. The Roman Empire had its own norms and practices regarding marriage and divorce, many of which were quite permissive and flexible. Amidst this cultural diversity, Paul offered guidance to believers, trying to balance Mosaic law, Jesus' teachings, and the realities of the lives of early Christians. In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul devotes an entire chapter to discussing marriage. In chapter 7, he gives clear and practical instructions on marriage, separation, and divorce. Paul begins by advising married couples not to separate. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord: a wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. This advice is in line with Jesus' teachings on the permanence of marriage. However, Paul understands the complexity of human relationships and the possibility of inevitable separations. In such cases, he urges people to remain single or reconcile, emphasizing the importance of faithfulness and reconciliation. Paul also addresses a specific situation for believers married to non-believers. In his letter to the Corinthians, he advises that if a non-believing spouse chooses to stay, the believer should not seek divorce. However, if the non-believing spouse decides to leave, the believer is not obligated to remain in that situation. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Here, Paul highlights the positive influence of a marital relationship and the peace that should prevail in the home. Paul's teachings show a deep understanding of marital life and its challenges. He recognizes the reality of sin and human imperfection, but also calls believers to seek reconciliation and peace. His words offer a balance between the firmness of divine principles and compassion for human circumstances. Are you facing difficulties in your marriage? Do you feel the pressure of differences in faith or the inevitable tensions of daily life? I invite you to seek guidance and strength in Paul's teachings. Let his counsel inspire you to seek peace, reconciliation, and faithfulness in your relationship. In the complexity of our modern lives, Paul's words remain relevant. They call us to a deeper commitment and to continually depend on God's grace in all our relationships. May we live these principles with integrity and love, always reflecting God's faithfulness and love in our lives. How can God transform the scars of divorce into signs of grace and restoration? Now, I want to explore with you how divine grace can offer you new hope and begin a healing process in your life. In biblical times, divorce was a complex and painful issue. The deeply religious Israelite society strictly followed Mosaic laws. However, the reality of life, with its failures and sins, often clashed with divine ideals. Despite the hardness of the human heart and legal concessions, God always showed a path of grace and redemption. One of the most moving stories about God's grace is found in John 8, verses 1 to 11, where a woman caught in adultery is brought before Jesus. The Pharisees, wanting to test him, asked if the woman should be stoned according to the law of Moses. Jesus, with his infinite wisdom, replied, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." One by one, the accusers left, leaving the woman alone with Jesus. He looked at her with compassion and said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." This story shows us that, although the law can condemn, God's grace offers forgiveness and a new opportunity. The story of this woman reflects the experience of many who have gone through the pain of divorce. Society, both then and now, can be quick to judge and condemn, but God offers a path of grace and restoration. In Paul's time, divorce was also a reality in the early church. In his letters, particularly in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul offers guidance on how believers should handle marriage and divorce. He acknowledges the hardness of the human heart, but also emphasizes the importance of reconciliation and peace. For Paul, God's grace always has the final word, offering hope even in the most difficult situations. It is important to remember that God's grace not only forgives but also transforms. In another passage, Paul writes, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." God's grace saves us, but it also calls us to live transformed lives, reflecting His love and mercy. In the complexity and pain of divorce, God's grace offers a path to healing and hope. The story of the woman caught in adultery and Paul's teachings remind us that we are not defined by our mistakes, but by God's transforming grace. I invite you to reflect on your life and relationships. Where do you need to experience God's grace and restoration? How can you be an agent of that grace in the lives of others? Let us always remember that, although we may face the pain and scars of the past, God's grace offers us new hope and a path to healing. Let us live in accordance with that grace, allowing it to transform our lives and relationships, reflecting God's love and faithfulness in all we do. What does God think about divorce? This question has led us to explore 5 uncomfortable truths, revealing God's original design for marriage, the concessions allowed by Moses, Jesus' teachings, Paul's instructions, and God's restoring grace. As we conclude this reflection, I want to share with you three main ideas and how we can apply them for our spiritual growth. First, marriage is a sacred and permanent union. From the beginning, God designed marriage as an indissoluble relationship between a man and a woman. In Genesis 2 verse 24, we read that they will become one flesh, which reflects a deep and eternal connection. This truth invites us to value and protect our marital relationships, striving to maintain unity and faithfulness, even amidst challenges. We must remember that marriage is not just a social contract, but a sacred covenant that reflects the relationship between Christ and the Church. Second, the hardness of the human heart has led to concessions, but this is not God's ideal. Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of the human heart, but this does not represent God's desire. Jesus reaffirmed this truth in Matthew 19 verses 8 to 9, reminding us that divorce is a response to the reality of sin, not a divine approval. In our lives, this challenges us to confront the hardness of our own hearts, always seeking reconciliation and forgiveness in our relationships. We must strive to overcome our failures and allow God's grace to transform our hearts and relationships. Third, God's grace and mercy are always present, even in our failures. Throughout the Bible, we see that God detests divorce, as mentioned in Malachi 2 verse 16, but he also offers grace and restoration to those who have gone through the pain of a broken marriage. In the Gospel of John, Jesus shows compassion to the woman caught in adultery, offering her forgiveness instead of condemnation. This lesson teaches us that, although we may face the pain and consequences of divorce, God's grace is available to heal and restore us. We must extend that same grace and compassion to others, helping them find hope and new life in Christ. As we reflect on these truths, let us remember the importance of honoring God's original design for marriage, confronting the hardness of our hearts, and always seeking grace and restoration in our relationships. By applying these lessons, we can grow spiritually, strengthen our relationships, and live according to God's love and faithfulness. May these truths inspire us to live with integrity and to reflect God's grace and mercy in all our relationships.